back, and Carl is also here in the back corner. He uses Angular on the DoubleClick team. So tonight we're going to have James talking about his take on Angular Seed and the stuff that he's been looking at for larger web applications. And later we're going to have Eric Duran come and show chromeHAR app that he built, and he's with Lullabot. So James from HBO is going to present first. And try not to use don't use the coffee grinder during talks. It's pretty loud. It comes up onto the mic. And when you ask questions, also make sure that you have a mic. So just wait a quick second, and Carl or Robbie will run over to you for a mic, because this is being recorded, and we'll put it on YouTube so that other people can see this talk. And another thing is we're going to have lightning talks from now on. So quick 5-minute show and tell sort of thing of what you're working on or what you're struggling with Angular. So starting next month, if we get enough people signed up for lightning talks. So go sign up on our Meetup page. Thanks.
Are they going to be the same meeting?
Yeah, the lightning talks will be together with these presentations. Yep.
Is that good?
Yep.
Good? Awesome. Cool. Hi everyone. This is the second time I'm getting a chance to talk to the Angular community here in New York, and I'm really excited. I've been working a lot with Angular, both professionally and personally with a lot of my own stuff, and so I've gotten quite a bit of experience with it, and the team that I work with has gotten quite a bit of experience with it, and we've formed a few ideas about what challenges we think it is that people getting introduced to Angular are running into. When you first begin to explore Angular, I'd imagine most people go online, they look at the documentation, they go through the tutorial, they browse the API, that sort of thing. When it comes time for you to actually put that to practice in your own application, the first thing you're given is this Angular Seed app, which is a wonderful starter tool, right? It gives you the very beginnings of an Angular app. The problem with the Angular Seed app is that it's not very useful past those initial exploration phases. They have this sort of package mechanism of stuffing. Is this getting too loud for anybody else, or is it just my own head? Okay. So they package everything inside of controller and services files, and things aren't organized in a way that scales sensibly. So if you're trying to build an enterprise scale application, or you're trying to build an application that you may be interested in looking at in 3 weeks, the Angular Seed app is not a great place to start. So rather than leave everybody to their own ideas about how to build the beginnings of meaningful Angular infrastructure, I thought that I would fork the Angular Seed app and create something that might be more useful. So I created what I'm calling Angular Sprout. So the idea is I'm taking the Seed app and giving it the very beginnings of what you need to build this thing out into a useful application. So in creating the Angular Seed app, that worked. Awesome. In creating the Angular Seed app, I realized I had to think about what it is I wanted a good Angular Seed application to do. What do I need when I'm starting as a developer and I have nothing else? And for me, there were 3 primary criteria. The first is that a good Angular Seed app, or a good Seed app in general, anytime you're firing up a new programming language for the first time, should be opinionated. Angular is a powerful, powerful framework, which means that there's lots of different ways to do things. It doesn't help you when you're learning for me to show you every single one of them. You can figure those out as you go along. You want to know, how should I do it? What's the best way to do it? Or what's a sensible approach to do it? It may not even be the best way, but what's a sensible way to approach this? So I made my Angular Seed app very, very opinionated. The second is that it needs to scale. The current Angular Seed application does not scale. So if you were writing an application and you started to put together a few hundred modules in this application, it would, you would have a controller file that got out of hand. You would, your services would become a big kludge, and it would be hard for your developers to find, different concerns. And the third criteria was that a good C application needs to be just light enough. And this is important because it needs to be light. You don't want to have to spend a day stripping out some baseline architecture just so that you can get started. But you also want this thing to have enough so that when you have a question, there's probably somewhere in the C app where you can find an answer immediately. When I started using the Angular C app, one of my first questions was, how do I build a meaningful directive, right? And that was hard to find. That information is actually surprisingly difficult to find. And when you do find it, there's so many different opinions about how it is you go about doing it. And even when you're doing it correctly, you could be doing it correctly in a different way depending on your architecture. So I wanted to make sure that I included a directive and I included a filter and I included all of the things that I think people have initial questions about, but not go too far. So let's talk about how the Angular Sprout app is opinionated. Oh, that looks weird on my screen. That looks fine. Okay. So one of the things that I think we need to keep in mind when we're building Angular applications is I'm fond of saying that I think Angular is the first enterprise like JavaScript library, and that's up for debate. But I come from a heavy back-end background. And specifically .NET, and one of the nice things that .NET gives you is this huge standard library of, you get dependency injection, you get a bunch of enterprise design patterns all in one. And for the first time, I felt comfortable in a JavaScript environment in a way that Backbone and some of these other applications haven't been able to do. Knockout does the binding thing that Angular does, but it doesn't give you some of the cool controller and services. You have to build all that stuff in yourself. Well, it does controllers, but it doesn't do things like dependency injection natively and a lot of stuff like that. So we're building an application. We're no longer building websites. And when you're structuring an application, you structure it very differently than when you're structuring a website. The Angular Sprout application that I built, the first thing I did, and the first opinion that I'm enforcing, that's a weird way of saying that, but the first opinion that I had is that we should organize our modules based on their concern. So having a catch-all file for controllers is not a good way to develop. As a developer, I'm asked to build something. I'm asked to build a menu. I'm asked to build a form. And so we should put all of the concerns for that form or that menu in the same folder as though we were building widgets or modules. So in my folder structure for the Angular Sprout application, the controller, if a controller, a service, a directive, and a filter are all sharing a concern, are all attempting to build one widget, they all sit in a folder together. And everything sits in a folder. Everything gets treated like a module. Even the application bootstrap gets put into an application module. That way, you can give that to a developer and say it's your job to maintain the routes, and it's your job to maintain the default CSS file. That's all sitting in in the top level application folder. One of the other things I did is say we shouldn't have our hierarchies be too deep. So I said the Angular Sprout app isn't going to have hierarchies deeper than 3 levels. Now, this isn't something that I think will necessarily work with everybody, but there's this assumption that as our IDEs are getting powerful, it's acceptable to throw, source files wherever it is they seem to fit, and I don't think that's true. I mean, no matter how good our IDEs get, I still love to root around in terminal, and I don't want to have to do cd/blah blah 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 blah. Even with tab completion, it's a pain. So I'm trying to be developer centric, and I'm trying to use conventions to make it really easy to navigate and really easy. I don't want you to think too hard about where you have to put something. It should be obvious. And if we only have 3 levels of hierarchy, it makes it a little bit more obvious. So as you can see here on on one side is how the Angular seed application currently works, which is that you have a top-level application folder, and then you kind of have a standard website hierarchy, a CSS folder, a JS folder, partials folder, images folder, that sort of thing. And that's just not helpful when you have several hundred different files to deal with. With Angular Sprout, I don't even know if it's visible at this level. It's a ridiculous font I chose. But the level below the app node it has, can you see this? Yes, you can. Has an application folder and a details folder for the detail level of the detail views. And I have a date time folder that holds a to-date string filter. And these things work, you can see it working a little bit like namespaces do in your traditional compiled languages. And so that was the idea. And this is just the beginning. I really hope that I get a lot of feedback on how to structure this even better. But again, like I said, I wanted to start with opinions. The second point is that I need this to be scalable. So we need to use conventions to make sure that it's really easy for me to know where to put a brand new module when I create it. And so doing something as simple as putting together a naming convention so that I know what to do with my controller, I know what to do with my partial, I know what to do with my services, my directives, and my templates. And I use templates to define partials that belong to directives. It was really important. And so I have this idea of files and namespaces over throwing things into packages. And the namespaces part is really important because this is just good old-fashioned JavaScript, good JavaScript. We were taught a long time ago that the global namespace is not a good neighborhood, right? We don't want to hang out there. We want to make sure that we're namespacing our things properly. So I wanted to give it to you up front. And the guys that created the Angular Seed app intentionally wanted to keep things lightweight. I'm pretty sure that the people behind Angular have heard of JavaScript namespaces, but they were trying to keep things light to keep you from getting confused. I'm trying to give you a little more to keep you from getting confused. So I think they're two different approaches. And so right up front in the Bootstrap JS file, I'm creating the main application namespace, and underneath that I'm creating namespaces for the controllers, namespaces for the filters, the services, and the directives, and instantiating the modules right up front so that this doesn't have to be done every single time you create a new module. And the third point is that this application, the Angular Sprout application, needs to be just light enough. And like I said, it's this idea that I should give you enough that you can reference a new idea really easily, or reference how to implement a new idea really easily, but not so much that you're removing things. So the three things that, three ways in which this, three examples in the Angular Sprout app in which of how this works is that I have real filters, real directives, and real tests. So I try to give you things that are not quite trivial, right? So they're a simple directive, but a directive that works like a directive that uses a link function, and a directive that that handles an event, a directive that has an isolated scope. These things that we're going to need to do when we're building. And I remember trying to figure out scope when I first started using directives, and that was like 3 days of my life. It's so much work, and it's powerful. That's because directives are powerful. And so I just wanted to give you, this is how I do a directive. You can take this, you can copy it, and you can create a million directives like this, and it's perfectly okay. There's lots of other ways to do it, but this is how I want to do it. And filters were the same thing. The filter, I think that was included with the Angular Seed app, just printed the version number of the Seed app, which wasn't a helpful way to show you how nobody's going to use a filter that way. Filters are used to actually filter things. They need to take an input and give you an output. So I wanted to give you a real filter. Real tests. This one, we don't have time to get into tests during this talk, but real tests are really important. And hopefully I get a chance to do another talk about testing in Angular. But testing in Angular is interesting because JavaScript testing is just kind of a new thing. It's not a thing we've really taken seriously up until recently. And the examples that you find on testing in the Angular documentation I don't think are the best way to test your app. There's this idea of end-to-end tests, and there's this idea of unit tests. And so there's this idea of unit tests and this idea of end-to-end testing. And often for things like filters and directives, the Angular documentation uses end-to-end testing. And it works because you can manipulate the DOM inside of an end-to-end test. But the problem with that is that if you're in an actual enterprise environment, if you're working, the people writing the end-to-end test is probably QA, because you got to remember the end-to-end tests have a different test runner than the unit test runner, and so you're messing up your workflow, right? So you're going to have two different test runners running at the same time, running two different types of tests just so that you can test one thing. And so what I'm not going to get to go into it in this presentation, but one of the things that you'll see in the Angular Sprout app is how to test directives and filters using unit testing techniques, not end-to-end testing techniques. So you're actually testing logic and not testing implementation. And then showing you how to use end-to-end tests properly to test implementation, to test things like navigation and entire scenarios. What happens when a person attempts to log in or create something, that kind of thing. So just light enough. You can check out the Angular Sprout app on my GitHub. I'll also post it on the meetup. And I wrote a blog post basically saying everything I've just set up here if you guys want to go over it again. So what I want to do now is show you guys the actual Angular Seed app and walk through it. And then if anybody has any questions, I would love to talk to you about why I did the things I did. So this may work and it may explode.
Just like that.
Yeah. All right. That look horrifying? A little bit. All right. So I'm going to shrink all these things down. So the root level of the Angular Sprout app looks pretty much like the Angular Seed app. There is something that I've done different. And one of the things that you'll notice right up front is that I have this E2E folder, this end-to-end folder in the root. And what this end-to-end folder is doing is it's giving you a place to put just your end-to-end tests. And the reason I've put this on the root is because I've discovered that the people who are probably going to be the most interested in your end-to-end tests are going to be QA, either you putting on a QA hat or an actual QA person, somebody that's going to be writing scenarios to test whether or not this thing actually does what you said it does. So I don't believe end-to-end tests and unit tests should live side by side. They're two very different things meant to test two very different concerns. And I actually find that the Angular, or that I'm using Testacular in this in the Angular Sprout app, and I think they just upgraded the Angular Seed app to Testacular. But one of the nice things that I'm going to say that wrong. It's going to be horrible. One of the things that Testacular gives you, and now I'm distracted, is this ability to write your end-to-end tests and your unit tests using basically the same syntax, using kind of the Jasmine syntax, and it can get really easy to throw everything in together. So I just want to give you a quick, kind of show you what I mean by an end-to-end test. So in this end-to-end test, what I'm doing is I'm testing the general layout of the Angular Sprout app. And what it's doing is I have this collection of views that come with the Sprout app. And it's looping through the views and making sure that the basic layout elements are the same for every view. So right now it's just checking to make sure that there is a menu on every single view. I'm sorry. I think so. I have.
You dim the front lights too?
Oh, that I don't know how to do. I actually have no idea how to make the font bigger.
Control Shift plus.
Control Shift.
What?
What? Command plus. Oh, look at that. Fancy. Awesome. So yeah. Sorry about So this is one of the simple end-to-end tests that I give you. But again, I want to have an opinion about how you should be using the end-to-end tests. You shouldn't be you shouldn't be writing a test for every single page that makes sure that your header is in the right place. That is a silly use of an end-to-end test, especially since they take so long to run. So this is an example. This is a technique I developed on my own, and I think it's a good thing to include. So it's an opinion I have. Like I said, remaining opinionated was really important to me. And then this home test does nothing, so it still needs a little work. So everything else about the root level is more or less the same with the Angular Seed app. So now if we get into the app folder being where everything actually lives in an Angular app, you'll see that what I've done is I've taken almost everything out of the root of the app folder, with the exception of the index.html and the index async.html. And I may even throw those into a folder, I don't know, just to keep a pattern. But inside my index, go away. Inside my index.html, you'll see that one of the consequences of this approach is that you're going to end up with a whole lot of includes, right? A whole lot of script references. And that's just fine. One of the things that this Angular Sprout app doesn't attempt to give you is a build process. If you're set up correctly, your build process will take all of these things and minify them or decide what's necessary or what isn't necessary. So I don't make any assumptions about what you guys have for a build process. And I find that however badly it might mess up the head, the head of your HTML, it's what you get by separating these concerns is so much more. There's also, in the index async, I haven't spent much time in there, but in the index async.html, if you guys have ever looked at it in the Angular Seed app, there's an example about how to do lazy loading of your modules. I think it's using a third-party library, because I'm not aware of any built-in lazy loading that Angular has. So there's this you can handle however you want. If you guys are using Require or one of the other module dependency managers, you're more than free to do that. But this is one of the consequences of this approach is that if in a meaningful size app, you'll end up with hundreds of script elements. But that's just fine. It isn't a big deal. So in the application folder here is where I'm keeping everything I need to bootstrap my Angular app, and including my CSS. The CSS, in my humble opinion, should live alongside whatever module it's attempting to style, right? And there's going to be lots of folders without CSS because lots of folders and lots of modules have nothing to do with the presentation layer. But the ones that do should have a CSS right there, because when you end up with several hundred CSS files, it's difficult to look through a folder to find what CSS file goes with what module you're working on. And so I believe putting everything in one place makes it so much easier. One of the other things I added is this configuration service. And what this configuration service does, it's a normal Angular service, but it's basically a constant service. It's where we allow you to define settings, operational constants. I'm going to add another one called strings that allows you to define things like labels and that kind of thing. And that's important, especially if you're doing something like internationalization. You want all your strings defined in one place to make it easy to replace them. Date time. Now this one is one that I've kind of struggled with. I'm not exactly sure what to do. I have this filter, and what it does is it takes and like a Unix epoch timestamp and converts it to a string. And it's kind of hard to figure out where to put that. At first, I put it in my details folder because that's where that's the only place in my app so far that was happening, that I was converting a timestamp. But then I go, yeah, but somebody else is going to need it. And then I remembered that if I wasn't working in JavaScript, programming languages have long taught us how to create namespaces and packages. I know I just called that a dirty word earlier, but to define this kind of thing. And so I was like, hey, let me create a module, and inside of that module, all of my date operations are going to live. And you can see how this can be expanded, and maybe I call this utilities or something if I don't, if I don't necessarily want to, if I have, 10 filters and they all do slightly different things, you don't want to put them in 10 different folders. So, this needs some work, and this architecture needs some thought and some discussion before it's perfect, to be sure. And if you look in the actual filter itself, it's doing something. It's actually taking in the timestamp. It's parsing it into an integer, creating a date time string out of it, and sending that back. It's not entirely trivial, but it's trivial enough that it's not going to get in your way. And this is kind of what I meant by just being light enough. It shows you how to use a filter, and this is how you would use a filter. You would have lots more logic in there, possibly for your filter, but this is how a filter is actually used, and it's a question that somebody would have. I'll jump down here to the menu, and here in the menu folder is where I define everything that happens in the menu, and my menu items are defined in directives instead of being defined right inside of the partial. And if we look at the directive again, it's an actual directive with an actual link function and an actual isolated scope, an actual two-way binding on that isolated scope. And I'm expressing the opinion that we shouldn't be. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, right. I'm expressing the opinion that when you're creating a directive, you should define your templates in a separate file. Angular lets you do this in lots of different ways. I think if you get in the habit of defining some of your directives in a template and some of your directives in line, or some of your templates in line, the developers on your team are going to have a really hard time finding your templates or understanding how to modify your templates. So, find a way to do it consistently, that kind of thing. There is, I don't have any unit tests in this one. I couldn't get latest from GitHub. But if I had unit tests in the Angular Sprout app, or when you go and you clone the GitHub or the Angular Sprout app, you'll see that the unit tests live right beside here. So if I was going to test my controller, I would have a menu-controller-unit file, and with Testacular, I can use wildcards to pick up my unit tests from whatever folders I want. So they don't need to sit in one place. Testacular is powerful enough to find them wherever they are, so why should we be constrained to putting everything in a test folder? Testing shouldn't be one person's responsibility anyway. Testing should be the responsibility of the person building the module if you're taking unit testing seriously. So to create a convention to help developers do that, I want to put everything right besides it. So I'll fire it up. It doesn't do a heck of a lot. It is just a CDAP after all. Scripts.